The Vietnam War, a conflict that was as complicated as trying to fold a fitted sheet. It's a war that's been etched into history, but understanding its origins and outcomes, well, that's like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube with one hand tied behind your back. But fear not, because in the next few minutes, we're going to break down the entire history of the Vietnam War. And no, we won't leave you with a headache. The story of the Vietnam War isn't just about troops in the jungle or helicopters flying through the mist. It's about a nation torn between ideologies, colonial legacies, and a struggle for independence. From the first shots fired in 1862 to the fall of Saigon in 1975, this conflict didn't just change Vietnam, it shook the world, leaving scars on the US, Southeast Asia, and even global politics. Before Vietnam became synonymous with helicopters, napalm, and protest chants, it had a history that's, let's just say, a bit less glamorous but equally important. It all began in the 19th century, when Vietnam was part of the sprawling French colonial empire. You see, long before the US was sending troops into Southeast Asia, the French had their own plans for dominance, and Vietnam was at the top of their list. In 1862, the French began their colonization of Vietnam, transforming it into part of their French Indochina colony. They didn't just invade, oh no, they set up shop, took control of the country's resources, and left the Vietnamese people with little more than a heavy tax burden and an authoritarian regime that didn't exactly win them any popularity contests. The French turned the fertile lands of Vietnam into cash cows, farming rice, rubber, and more. If you've ever wondered why some of the most intense struggles for independence happened in Southeast Asia, look no further than colonialism. But it wasn't all quiet submission. From the very start, the Vietnamese didn't exactly roll over. The French faced resistance from various groups, most notably the early nationalist movements that slowly began to stir in the early 1900s. The most famous of these early resistances? Ho Chi Minh. You've probably heard his name, and no, he wasn't born with a beard and a leadership vision for a divided country. Ho started out as an anti-colonial activist in his youth, and let me tell you, he wasn't the type to back down. Fast forward to World War II. France, distracted by its own internal struggles, looking at you Nazis, had to abandon its empire for a while, and Vietnam was no exception. The Japanese saw an opportunity and swooped in, occupying Vietnam from 1940 to 1945. Now, for the Vietnamese, this was yet another foreign invader who thought they could tell them what to do. And surprise, surprise, the Vietnamese weren't thrilled. But the silver lining? This was the time that the Viet Minh, a communist-led resistance movement, started to form under Ho Chi Minh's leadership. By the time the Japanese were booted out at the end of World War II, the Viet Minh were not only surviving, they were thriving, growing stronger and more organized. And what did they want? Not much, just an independent Vietnam, free from the clutches of colonial rule. But the French had other plans, and as soon as the Japanese were out, the French came back in like an unwanted ex, determined to reclaim what they thought was theirs. And so began the real groundwork for the war to come. Vietnam wasn't just fighting for independence, they were fighting for the right to exist on their own terms. In the next chapter, we'll see how this struggle evolved into the full-blown conflict that became the First Indochina War, where both sides would clash head-on. After WW II, things didn't exactly get easier for Vietnam. You'd think that with the fall of the Japanese Empire, Vietnam might get a moment of peace. But nope, they were caught in a struggle between two powerful forces, the French trying to reassert control, and the Viet Minh fighting to take what they saw as their hard-earned freedom. This, my friends, was the beginning of the First Indochina War. It all kicked off in 1946, when the French, fresh from their own defeat in the Second World War, decided it was time to reclaim their former colonies. They weren't exactly invited back, but they came anyway, ready to remind everyone who was in charge. The French forces came back to Vietnam with their usual colonial pomp, and what followed was a bloody 8-year conflict. But the Viet Minh weren't going down without a fight. Under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, they didn't just resist, they fought back fiercely, using guerrilla tactics, blending into the jungle like it was second nature. For the French, this was like fighting a ghost. The Viet Minh were everywhere and nowhere at the same time, attacking supply lines, ambushing French patrols, and making life miserable for the colonial forces. The war wasn't all guerrilla warfare, though. It had its fair share of big battles, and one of the most famous, or infamous, depending on your perspective, was the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. This battle was the equivalent of a David versus Goliath match, but in this case, Goliath didn't win. The French had a plan: set up a stronghold in the valley of Dien Bien Phu, deep in the mountains, to try to cut off Viet Minh supply lines and lure them into a trap. Sounds like a solid military strategy, right? Well, not so much. The Viet Minh, led by General Vong Nguyen Giap, had other ideas. They surrounded the French forces, dug in, and after weeks of intense fighting, the French found themselves trapped, outnumbered, and overwhelmed. In May of 1954, the French finally surrendered. Dien Bien Phu was a crushing defeat for them, but more importantly, it was a turning point for the entire region. The French could no longer maintain their colonial rule in Indochina, and their defeat at Dien Bien Phu forced them to negotiate. This all led to the Geneva Accords of 1954, where the world powers came together and agreed to temporarily divide Vietnam at the 17th parallel, because apparently one of the most war-torn countries in history needed more lines on the map. The North went to Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, and the South became a separate, non-communist state led by Ngo Dinh Diem. And just like that, Vietnam was split in two, setting the stage for even more chaos in the years to come. While the Geneva Accords may have seemed like a peace deal, the tension was far from over. The division was supposed to be temporary, but both sides dug in their heels. The North, now under Ho Chi Minh's leadership, became a communist state, and the South, supported by the United States, moved in the opposite direction, establishing an anti-communist government. The two sides, each backed by powerful allies, North Vietnam with the Soviet Union and China, and South Vietnam with the United States, were now on a collision course. What started as a war for independence had now morphed into something much bigger. So Vietnam is now divided, and you might think, well, that's that. Peace at last, right? If only it were that simple. The Geneva Accords might have drawn a line on a map, but the divide between North and South Vietnam was far from peaceful. In fact, what came next was like opening a can of worms that no one could close. In 1955, the South got its own government, led by Ngo Dinh Diem, a man with a reputation for being, let's say, less than popular. Diem was put in power by the United States, who were eager to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. The South was supposed to be a bulwark against the rise of communism, but Diem wasn't exactly the people's hero. His government was corrupt, he alienated religious groups, and he wasn't exactly the most welcoming leader to the country's ethnic minorities. But despite his unpopularity, the US supported him, pouring in financial and military aid because, hey, he was anti-communist. And that was really all that mattered to the United States at the time: containment of communism, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, in the North, Ho Chi Minh was not sitting idly by. Oh no, he was busy solidifying control over his newly established communist state. The North had the backing of the Soviet Union and China, which gave them a substantial advantage in terms of resources. And it wasn't just about controlling territory, it was about uniting the country under a single banner: communism. As you might guess, the South didn't exactly sit back and relax while all this was happening. Guerrilla movements, supported by the North, began to rise up in the South, especially in rural areas. These guerrillas were known as the Viet Cong, and they were, to put it mildly, a thorn in the side of Diem's government. The Viet Cong weren't just fighting for the North, they were fighting for the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese people, many of whom felt neglected or oppressed by Diem's rule. At first, the US tried to fight this insurgency with military aid, sending more advisors and support. But the situation was quickly spiraling out of control. the South was losing ground and the Viet Cong were gaining in strength and numbers. It became clear that the war was going to be more complicated than anyone had anticipated. And so, enter the United States in a more direct way. In the early 1960s, the U.S. began ramping up its involvement, sending more military advisors and equipment to help the South Vietnamese government. But this wasn't just about assisting in a local conflict. The U.S. was already looking at the bigger picture, the Cold War. The idea was that if Vietnam fell to communism, the rest of Southeast Asia could follow, dominoes falling one by one. In 1963, just as the U.S. was starting to increase its commitment to South Vietnam, the unthinkable happened. Ngo Dinh Diem, that unpopular leader, was overthrown and assassinated in a military coup, leaving South Vietnam in chaos. And guess who was left holding the bag? That's right, the United States. Now they were not only dealing with a fragile South Vietnamese government, but also trying to make sense of a country in complete disarray. With Diem out of the picture, the South had no stable leadership and the Viet Cong's presence was growing stronger. The situation was getting worse, and the U.S. was starting to realize that this was no longer just a matter of sending some advisors. The writing was on the wall. They were about to be pulled deeper into the conflict, whether they liked it or not. So, what happened next? Well, the world was about to see how a small conflict in Southeast Asia could explode into a full-blown war that would change the course of history. All right, buckle up, because this is where things start to get real. Up until now, the Vietnam War had been a somewhat indirect affair for the U.S., with advisors, military aid, and support for South Vietnam. But in 1965, the game changed. The United States wasn't just going to be the backup singer anymore, they were taking center stage in the war. It all began with the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964, which, let's be honest, could have been a scene out of a spy thriller. The U.S. Navy reported that 2 of their destroyers had been attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of North Vietnam. The incident was murky at best, with questions later arising about whether the attacks had even happened as reported. But here's the kicker. The U.S. government used the incident as justification for escalating involvement. Enter the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which essentially handed President Lyndon B. Johnson a blank check to wage war in Vietnam. The resolution passed with overwhelming support, and suddenly, U.S. military action in Vietnam was no longer a suggestion. In March 1965, the first official U.S. combat troops were deployed to Vietnam. What started as a limited advisory mission to help South Vietnam had now turned into a full-fledged military intervention. At this point, there was no turning back. In those early months of 1965, the U.S. military strategy was straightforward: destroy the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese armies, NVA, supply lines, and use airstrikes to weaken their forces. The U.S. unleashed a bombardment campaign that became infamous for its scale, Operation Rolling Thunder. It lasted for 3 years, dropping bombs on North Vietnam in an attempt to cripple the enemy's ability to wage war. But here's the problem. While the bombing devastated the North, it didn't stop the Viet Cong or the NVA. In fact, it only galvanized them, causing their ranks to swell with more recruits determined to resist the U.S. By the time U.S. ground forces were introduced into the conflict, the war had taken on a new character. The strategy now was to engage in search and destroy missions, find the enemy, eliminate them, and move on. It sounded simple enough, but fighting in the dense jungles of Vietnam was far more complicated than anyone imagined. The U.S. troops, despite their superior equipment and firepower, were fighting against an enemy that was familiar with the terrain, highly motivated, and willing to endure significant hardship. The U.S. military wasn't prepared for the type of warfare it encountered. The Viet Cong used the jungle to their advantage, setting up booby traps, hiding in tunnels, and launching guerrilla attacks. They were everywhere, yet nowhere. This wasn't a traditional war. And as the Americans dug deeper into the conflict, the body count began to rise, and so did the criticism back home. But it wasn't just the battlefield that was a problem. The American public was starting to notice the discrepancy between what the government said about the war and what was actually happening on the ground. The media began to report the harsh realities of combat, showing the devastation, the body bags, and the toll the war was taking on soldiers and civilians alike. In 1968, the war hit a turning point that shocked everyone: the Tet Offensive. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces launched a coordinated attack on over 100 cities and military targets across South Vietnam. They breached the U.S. Embassy in Saigon and fought hard, even during the traditional ceasefire for the Lunar New Year. The offensive was a military failure for the North. They didn't hold any of the cities they attacked. But here's the twist: the Tet Offensive was a psychological victory. It shattered the illusion that the U.S. was winning the war. It showed that the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese were not only alive and kicking, but they could still deliver a blow to the heart of South Vietnam. The Tet Offensive had a profound impact on American opinion. Up until then, the U.S. government had been assuring the public that victory was just around the corner. But after Tet, the American public was questioning everything. The war wasn't going as promised, and the casualties were mounting. It marked a major turning point in the war, leading to a shift in U.S. policy and public sentiment. By the end of 1968, the war had become a political minefield in the U.S. President Johnson, who had escalated the war, found himself facing mounting protests at home and growing discontent among his own advisors. It was clear that the road ahead was not going to be easy. In the next chapter, we'll see how President Nixon tried to shift U.S. strategy and begin the difficult process of withdrawing American troops from Vietnam. As the Vietnam War raged on, the United States found itself trapped in a battle on multiple fronts. Not just against the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, but also at home, where public opinion was rapidly turning against the war. The American people, once united in their support for the conflict, were now divided. The war had gone from being a necessary fight against communism to a quagmire that seemed to have no end. And this, my friends, is where things get interesting. In 1969, Richard Nixon took office as president, inheriting the war that had escalated under his predecessors. Nixon, like many before him, was determined to secure a victory in Vietnam. But here's the twist. While he wasn't about to pull out immediately, he had a plan that he thought would end the war without conceding defeat. This plan was called Vietnamization. So what exactly was Vietnamization? Essentially, it was the idea that the U.S. would gradually reduce its military presence in Vietnam while simultaneously increasing the capability of the South Vietnamese army to take on the fight themselves. It sounded good in theory, but there was a major problem. The South Vietnamese forces weren't anywhere near ready to fight the war on their own. So, while American troops began to withdraw, the fighting didn't stop. Nixon also expanded the war effort into neighboring countries like Cambodia and Laos in an attempt to wipe out Viet Cong supply routes. The U.S. military was on a mission to eliminate the enemy wherever they could find them, even if it meant stepping outside of Vietnam's borders. But these secret bombing campaigns, which were kept under wraps for a while, only served to inflame public anger. The American public wasn't happy about bombing countries that weren't even part of the war. The cover-up only added fuel to the fire. Meanwhile, back in the U.S., anti-war protests were reaching their peak. College campuses, once the sites of youthful optimism, became battlegrounds for political activism. One of the most significant moments of this was the Kent State shooting in May 1970. Ohio National Guardsmen opened fire on students protesting the war, killing 4. The image of young, unarmed students being shot by soldiers sent shockwaves through the nation. It was a moment that exposed the deep division in American society, with one side advocating for peace and the other side insisting that victory in Vietnam was necessary at all costs. The protests were not just confined to college campuses. Across the nation, people were demanding an end to the war. The frustration was palpable. Families who had sent their sons off to fight were now seeing the human toll of the conflict. The number of American casualties continued to rise, and as the body bags came back home, the American public was asking, why are we still here? The longer the war dragged on, the more it felt like a losing battle. In 1973, after years of stalemate and negotiations, the US and North Vietnam reached an agreement, the Paris Peace Accords. This treaty would supposedly end the war, with a ceasefire in place and US troops withdrawing from Vietnam. The agreement was hailed as a victory for Nixon, but the reality was far from that. While American troops were leaving, the conflict in Vietnam was far from over. At home, Nixon tried to sell the peace accord as a success, but the American public knew better. The war, while officially over for the US, was still ongoing in Vietnam. And while many Americans were relieved to see the troops come home, they knew the peace they were promised might not last. But here's the thing. Nixon's efforts to end the war were about more than just the battlefield. He had his eyes set on securing a legacy, one where the United States could leave Vietnam without outright admitting defeat. That, however, would prove to be a nearly impossible task. And as we'll see in the next chapter, the war's conclusion would be far more catastrophic than anyone expected. Well, folks, here we are. After years of turmoil, politics, and endless military campaigns, we're at the end of the line. The US has withdrawn its troops, the Paris Peace Accords are signed, and it seems like peace is on the horizon. But as any veteran of history will tell you, the end of one chapter often means the beginning of another, and this one is going to be a doozy. In 1973, after years of fighting, the Paris Peace Accords were supposed to be the solution. The US agreed to pull out of Vietnam, and North Vietnam promised a ceasefire. It seemed like a win for everyone. The US would leave, and South Vietnam would be left to defend itself against the North. What could possibly go wrong, right? Well, as it turns out, a lot. The truth was, South Vietnam was never really ready to stand on its own. The US had been the backbone of the South's military and economic stability for over a decade. When American troops left, so did much of the support South Vietnam had relied on. And it didn't take long for the North to recognize that this was their moment to strike. With the US out of the picture, North Vietnam began launching a series of offensives aimed at toppling the South Vietnamese government. By the mid-1970s, it was clear that the South couldn't stand up to the North without the help of the US. The US may have pulled out, but North Vietnam was still in full swing, and the South was crumbling under the pressure. The North's strategy was simple. They had to take Saigon, the heart of the South, and with it, the soul of the South Vietnamese government. By 1975, it was no longer a question of if Saigon would fall, but when. The North Vietnamese, led by General Giap, moved relentlessly toward the south. They quickly broke through South Vietnam's defenses, which had been weakened by years of war and lack of support. Despite the South's attempts to put up a fight, it was clear the war was nearing its end. On April 30th, 1975, the unthinkable happened. The North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon, and the South Vietnamese government collapsed. The Fall of Saigon marked the official end of the Vietnam War. The city, once a symbol of hope for the South, was now a symbol of defeat. The American embassy was overrun, and US personnel were airlifted out in a chaotic and desperate evacuation. This was not the dignified end the US had hoped for. It was a humiliating, rushed retreat, a final reminder that the war had been lost. The aftermath of the Fall of Saigon was catastrophic for the people of South Vietnam. Thousands of South Vietnamese tried to flee the country, desperate to escape the communist regime. Many were forced to live in refugee camps, while others risked their lives on boats in search of safety. The war had left deep scars on the nation, and now, under communist rule, Vietnam would have to rebuild from the ashes. But the consequences of the war didn't just impact Vietnam. The United States, despite having pulled out, had left with a significant loss of reputation and national pride. The war had taken an enormous toll on the American public, the military, and the economy. The death toll was staggering. Over 58,000 American soldiers had lost their lives, along with millions of Vietnamese, both soldiers and civilians. The legacy of the war left a country divided, disillusioned, and questioning its place in the world. So, with the fall of Saigon, the Vietnam War officially came to an end. But the echoes of the war would be felt for decades to come, both in the US and in Vietnam. The scars of conflict didn't simply vanish with the signing of peace accords or the fall of a city. Vietnam was left to pick up the pieces, and the US was left to grapple with its own painful lessons. As for Vietnam, the war was over, but the rebuilding process would be long and arduous. The country was officially unified under communist rule, but the road ahead was fraught with challenges, politically, socially, and economically. The fall of Saigon wasn't just the end of a war. It was a defining moment in history, a moment that shaped US foreign policy, changed the course of Southeast Asia, and left a deep imprint on both the American and Vietnamese consciousness. But despite the devastation, the world moved on, and Vietnam eventually found a way to heal. And just like that, the Vietnam War came to an end. But if you think the story ends with the fall of Saigon in 1975, you'd be mistaken. The consequences of this conflict have rippled through history, shaping not only Vietnam, but also the United States and the world at large. For Vietnam, the war's aftermath was an incredibly difficult journey. The country had to rebuild not just its physical infrastructure, but its social fabric as well. Decades of war had left deep scars, and unification under communist rule wasn't an instant fix. For the next several years, Vietnam would struggle with poverty, political repression, and international isolation. But over time, the country began to recover, with its economy slowly growing and its global standing gradually improving. As for the United States, the Vietnam War left a lasting legacy of disillusionment. The war, which had been sold as a fight against the spread of communism, ended in defeat, leaving many Americans questioning their government and their role in global conflicts. The images of the war, the protests, the body bags, and the desperate scenes from the fall of Saigon are all burned into the collective memory of a generation. The Vietnam War also deeply influenced US foreign policy. After Vietnam, there was a reluctance to engage in military interventions, especially without clear goals or public support. The lessons learned, or rather the mistakes made, would shape how the US approached conflicts for decades to come. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Vietnam War is the question it left behind. What is the true cost of war? How do we measure the toll it takes, not just on soldiers, but on societies, families, and the very idea of nationhood? And most importantly, what can we learn from the Vietnam War that might help us avoid repeating its mistakes in the future? Because, as history has shown us, the lessons of war are often hard to swallow, but they're lessons that are crucial for shaping a better future. The Vietnam War was a tragedy in many ways, but it also provides us with critical lessons about the complexities of war, the importance of understanding local context, the costs of intervention, and the power of diplomacy. As we close this chapter of history, let's remember the courage and sacrifices of the people who lived through it, both in Vietnam and in the United States. Their experiences remind us that the human cost of war is far greater than we often realize, and it's something we should never take lightly. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the history of the Vietnam War.
History is never just about the past. It's about understanding how we got here and how we can learn from those lessons to build a better future. Until next time, keep learning, stay curious, and never stop asking questions about the world around you. The more we understand the past, the better equipped we are to shape the future. See you in the next video.